Bonjour à tous. Voici la première des 7 présentations qui vous sont proposées dans le cadre de cette UE sur la naissance et la construction de la nation américaine. D'ailleurs, vous allez entendre des voix différentes puisque nous sommes 6 intervenants différents pour ces présentations. Avant de vous parler de la manière dont la nation américaine s'est développée, je vous propose des éléments de contexte assez larges en évoquant rapidement les premiers contacts entre les Indiens et les Européens. Early contacts between Native Americans and Europeans. So the first question that comes to mind, of course, when speaking about American Indians is, where did they come from? Archaeological evidence indicates that during the Ice Age, that is to say from 2.6 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, American Indians came from Eastern Asia in several migrations. They did not come in one block. They crossed a land bridge which connected Siberia to what is now Alaska and North America. This land bridge is often referred to as Beringia. And although the population was originally sparse, different bands of Indians met with one another, combined, divided into new groups, and adapted to various environments. In the 1,000 years that followed the Ice Age, cultural exchanges and migrations on the whole American continent accelerated the differentiation among peoples and their developing cultures. As I just said, there were several waves of Asian migrants. From 15,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, small groups of hunters sailed in small boats from Siberia to Alaska using this land bridge. Then they went as far down as South America. As the weather became warmer and as the larger mammoths died out, larger bands of nomadic people adapted to these climate changes and hunted smaller mammoths, learned to fish and pick berries. They also developed new kinds of weapons like bows and arrows, and nets and hooks for fishing. 9,000 years ago, a second wave of migrants went to the southwest of the present-day United States. They came to be known as the Apache and the Navajo. Incidentally, I'm following the recommendation of archaeologists and keeping their names, the names of Indian tribes, in the singular, because most Indian languages do not make a distinction between the singular and the plural. A third wave arrived 5,000 years ago and settled the Arctic coast of North America. They became the Inuit. About 2,000 years ago, 3 great crops were brought from South America into North America. These 3 crops were corn, squash, and beans. As I said, each group developed its own culture and customs. Now, to keep differences simple, 7 main groups can be distinguished. I'll start with tribes of the Northeast. Northeastern tribes, where most Indians lived in small bands and were farmers, also relying on hunting and fishing. In the 18th and 19th centuries, they grew dependent on the fur trade with Europeans. And to give you one example of these tribes, I'll mention the Ottawa. Then there were southeastern tribes. They were sedentary tribes and were heavily dependent on agriculture. They were influenced by the political structure of English colonies and adopted several of the English cultural patterns. This was one of the reasons why they were called the 5 civilized tribes, namely the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Next, a few words about Indians of the Great Plains. Some were sedentary, like the Mandan or the Pawnee. They lived in villages and were farmers. Their villages were major trading and political centers. Others, such as the Sioux, were nomadic and relied more heavily upon hunting. There were also tribes of the Southwest. That is to say, tribes who lived in desert-like areas. They lived in villages that the Spanish called pueblos. They were farmers, wove cotton cloth, and designed elaborate pottery. Among them are the Zuni or the Hopi. But there were also nomadic tribes, like the Navajo. Then there were Pacific Coast Indians who lived in small bands. Usually they reunited in villages for the winter. Most were hunters, fishermen, and gatherers. One example is the Chinook. And the last group that I'll mention very quickly is the group made of Alaska Indians, mostly fishermen like the Aleut. Now, a few words about the first Europeans in the New World. As you probably know, Vikings, or Norse as they were called, were probably the first Europeans who sailed to the New World, which they called Vinland, in the 10th century or 11th century. Two epic Viking tales, written around 1200 or 1300, describe a Norseman's trip to the New World. Archaeological evidence shows that the Norse traded with both Inuit and more southern tribes for skins, and probably founded colonies in Maine, which is the area in red on the map on the left, and Rhode Island, the small area in red on the map on the right, and also probably further down the Atlantic coast. But because of climatic change in the 12th century, change called the Little Ice Age, they could not stay in their settlements and went back to Scandinavia. However, their discoveries proved a dead end because their expeditions remained unknown outside of the northwestern part of Scandinavia. Now I come to Christopher Columbus. As you know, Christopher Columbus never actually set foot on the North American continent. His different travels took him to the Bahamas, what we now call the Bahamas, that is, say, to the Caribbean. His expeditions across the Atlantic Ocean were sponsored by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. These monarchs and the Spanish wanted to be the first to discover the Northwest Passage. Now you have to know that in the 15th century, European merchants were eager to buy and sell spices, dyestuffs, and gems. But in order to acquire them, they had to travel all the way to Asia via the powerful and dangerous Persian world if they followed a land itinerary. This meant very costly and dangerous journeys by land. So they started looking westwards, started looking for a direct waterway in temperate climate in order to reach Asia. So the idea was that when leaving Europe, maybe they would reach some kind of a land and cross that land. Of course, in the 15th century, nobody knew how wide the American continent was. So travel on rivers and then cross maybe some kind of ocean or sea and eventually reach China and Asia. That was the idea for the Northwest Passage. Explorers believed that by going westwards, you could very easily travel on rivers and reach Asia. And looking for the Northwest Passage became an obsession and remained one until the first decade of the 20th century. In the first decade of the 20th century, two Norwegians discovered a Northwest Passage going all the way up north of the Arctic Circle even. but of course that was not the case in the 15th century. The Spanish monarchs also wanted to convert the native populations to Catholicism. But on October the 12th, 1492, Christopher Columbus reached a land which he believed to be East India. Hence the name he gave to the native inhabitants he saw. He called them Indians. Yet he had reached not Asia, but the West Indies, les Antilles. And the name Indians, a misnomer, remained to refer to the locals of the American continent. At the end of the 15th century, there were 50 to 100 million inhabitants, that is to say Indians, on the whole American continent. About 5 to 10 million lived north of Mexico. Native Americans had dogs, llamas, alpacas, but no horses. No Indian society had shaped metal into guns, swords, or tools. No Indian society had gunpowder or sailing ships. And the people living north of Mexico spoke more than 250 different languages. As I said, Indians did not have horses. Horses were introduced by the Spanish in the 17th century. Now the consequences were both beneficent and negative. They were positive for nomadic tribes because they could move more easily from one place to another place, and they could use the horses to carry heavy items. But they were negative for sedentary tribes who became the targets of raids by buffalo hunters. Europeans also introduced other animals such as dogs, pigs, sheep, and cattle. They unwittingly introduced diseases. Europeans were not aware that Indians were not immune to European diseases. And anyway, they would not have had the scientific knowledge to spread European illnesses intentionally. What characterized Europeans in the 15th century was ethnocentrism. In the 15th and 16th centuries, and even later, Europeans were convinced that they were superior to all other peoples and that these other peoples were savage tribes. So they expected Indian societies to abandon their beliefs and traditions in order to embrace those of the newcomers. And when Native Americans refused to give up their customs and beliefs, Europeans became convinced that Indians were uncivilized heathens, that is to say non-Christians, and they tried to subdue them. They held that whatever was not European was inferior and that Europe was at the center of everything. And for instance, when they set foot on the American continent, they were convinced that America was just in the periphery of Europe. That was their viewpoint. And so all these notions partake of ethnocentrism. Thanks to the newly invented printing press, word of Columbus's voyages quickly spread throughout Europe and spurred other nations to cross the Atlantic Ocean on ships similar to the Spanish caravels. The Spaniards established the first colonial empire in the New World, and for about 100 years they dominated the New World, attempting to keep other countries from acquiring any of the wealth of America. Conquistadores, that is to say, independent Spanish adventurers, were cruel and ruthless in their way of dealing with Native Americans. In 1550-1551, the King of Spain, Charles V, convened a meeting of theologians and jurists in the Spanish town of Valladolid to discuss the rights and treatment of indigenous people in the New World. Two men in particular opposed each other. Las Casas, who believed that Indians had souls and therefore should be converted to Catholicism in a gentle way, and Sepúlveda, who believed that Indians were savages who ought to be converted by force or killed. Now, after this meeting, both parties claimed that they had won. The Spaniards did not change the way they treated Indians afterwards, but they resorted to African slaves in order to work in their settlements in the New World. When several European nations had established colonies in the North American continent, each country needed Indians as trading partners, guides, religious converts, and military allies. Of course, Native Americans resisted the Europeans' attempts at gaining more and more land, which more often than not resulted in warfare. Here is a selection of the main conflicts that took place between the whites and the Native Americans from the 15th century to the 18th century. And you'll hear more about later stages of these conflicts and wars in following lectures and presentations. Thank you.